I'm Julian Gooding, and I'm out at the Wando Mount Pleasant Libraries in Adult Services. And one of my other tasks out at the Wando Mount Pleasant Library is that I manage the digital studios that are out there. So hopefully once we get back to normal and our libraries are back open, I hope to see you all out there to perhaps use our studios to create content like this. For nearly 3 decades now, I've been creating programming that usually centers around celebrating who we are as a people. All aspects of who we are as human beings, cultural diversity, getting to know one another, sometimes trying to create that space that we can sit down comfortably to have those difficult and uncomfortable conversations, and understanding racial disparities and understanding exactly what systemic racism is. So this year's summer reading theme is Imagine Your Story. So let's begin first with understanding what systemic racism is as I get you to try to imagine my story. What exactly is systemic racism? The NAACP's definition of systemic racism is systems and structures that have procedures or processes that disadvantages African Americans. Others say the definition is the complex interaction of culture, policy, and institutions that holds in place the outcomes we see in our lives. Imagine my story and the individuals who helped to develop me as the man that I am today. Imagine those black lives that I came in contact with in the 60s. And these black lives who had to flee the Deep South and begin again. You'll hear that theme oftentimes mentioned, begin again. See, these were black men and women, a community that surrounded and protected me, an all-black community. See, I speak this way and I carry myself this way, not because of the years that I lived in white communities and went to white schools, but the fact that I lived in a black community in Washington, D.C. These were black men and women who had to flee this mass exodus called the Great Migration. The Great Migration, this mass exodus of African Americans, millions of African Americans, happened between the years of 1916 to 1970. So imagine these individuals having to flee, having to begin again in places like Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, New York City, some in Boston, Chicago, California. Some went as far as Toronto because they were denied that simple access to education, economic prosperity, the right to vote. Their lives were threatened, and some had lost family members due to this violence. And these are the individuals that are teaching me and raising me, giving me history that you won't find in any history book still to this day. Those are the individuals, if you can imagine my story being taught by those men and women who are the architects of the Harlem Renaissance, the jazz era going up and down the U Street corridors of Washington, D.C., the writers, the poets, the painters, the sculptors, and the politicians, and those wonderful teachers. Imagine my grandparents not wanting to leave the South because of that. My grandparents were fortunate to get a home through Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal. People after the Great Depression, down on their luck, needed help. And they prospered on that land. So because of that prosperity and that success that my grandparents were having in this town in North Carolina, they were met with what I call phase 1. They were attacked economically. They were denied the right to be able to sell their goods and products, to build wealth. Not only were they not buying their goods, but they were denied access to the general store in that town. And on Saturdays, black folk could only shop after lunch for about an hour. And they went as far as raising the prices so that the black folk ended up having to pull more money out of their pocket in order just to have, say, seeds or to buy a shovel. Now imagine my grandparents still refusing to give in. So they moved to what I refer to as phase 2. with systemic racism. My grandparents said, we're going to vote. We're going to start voting in individuals in order to have better representation and to get respect, to get clean water, have access to schools. And they were met with poll taxes, literacy tests. We hear people talking right now about how you had to count beans or jelly beans in a jar, and if you couldn't guess how many jelly beans were in that jar, you weren't allowed to vote. This is an example of a registration form right here in South Carolina, where it states very clearly that you have to pay a poll tax and or pass a literacy test by reading and or writing information from the South Carolina Constitution. And these are individuals that are coming out of slavery, out of bondage, who may not have ever had access to education. So they knew this. See, that's the tactic within systemic racism. You try to hit us in the wallet, and then you deny us the right to be able to vote. The democracy, the one thing that's within our Constitution, that aspect of democracy that we hold so dear, that all men are created equal, and that right to vote. See, many people think that black folk got their freedom after the Civil War, but we really didn't get our true freedom and independence until 1965. 1865 to 1965, 100 years of not having the right to vote. Imagine my grandparents realizing that, but still persevering and pushing through. My grandparents decided to take it upon themselves to teach literacy so that we could possibly have a chance of that American dream. So here comes the heavy policing, the violence, domestic terrorism. See, now that's the main powerful phase of systemic racism. Murder, lynchings, rapes, intimidation. All they were doing was teaching folks how to read and write. And now they were met with threats of violence. They were told that if you didn't stop what you were doing, something may happen to your children. So my grandparents, if you can imagine their story, their feelings, their emotions of now having to pack up and flee the very farm that they loved so much and have to come to Washington, D.C. because they're worried about their children's black lives. They're worried about their two sons, my uncles, and whether or not they're going to be arrested on some petty, trumped-up charges and find themselves in jail or on a chain gang, or even worse, lynched. Or their daughters, my aunts, my mother, same fate, or even worse, rape. Now imagine my parents now growing up in a new city, going from a farm to living in an urban lifestyle. Although Washington, D.C. is a fantastic and wonderful city, it's not who my mother was, and it's not who my grandmother was. In fact, my grandmother drove back to North Carolina every month to sit on a porch of a friend of hers just to look at the land that she had to flee. Now imagine my father's story, and he's witnessing the abuse on sharecroppers for tobacco farms. You see, one of the tactics that they would do again, denying access to education. See, if you were a sharecropper and you had children, and your children were in school, you're fortunate enough to be able to go to school, white supremacists don't want that education. They don't want you to be able to rise up and care for yourself. So what they would say to that man who's the sharecropper who had a son that's around 13 years old, 14 years old, he would say, you know what, you've got a good crop this year, and we're going to need some help picking all this tobacco. Now you may hear a white man telling a black man, here's an opportunity for more money. Bring your son and we'll give your son a job, so even more money. Well, first of all, they weren't paid practically anything. But what was really being said, and what the black folk understood and knew, was that if you didn't bring your son to the plantation, take him out of school, you would be out of a job. And we'd make certain that everybody in the town knew you're not staying in your place. And you'll never be able to get a job in that town again, and your son won't be able to work. So you have to bring your son to the plantation and take him out of school, deny him the access to education. And so now you have two generations trapped into sharecropping and making no money. That was what my father was escaping, and found himself in the Navy, serving this country, and only to find that systemic racism is there as well. So here's my mother and father having to begin again. Now imagine their story in Washington, D.C., a more northern territory. I remember the excitement when my parents were able to find a home after the Fair Housing Act was passed that made it illegal to deny black people access to living in the suburbs. See, my parents were now dealing with the issues of what is called redlining, where you take communities and you literally draw a red line around areas or shade in on a map where you want all the black folk to be pushed into, and that's where they're going to have to live. And all the white folk, what is referred to as white flight, flies out of those regions and go live in other parts of the city. And what happens if you are put into that red-lined area, you have no economic prosperity. See, they devalue your home. And that collateral and that value of your home is what helps you to have wealth. See, you could use that money to use as collateral to get a bank loan for your business, or use that to get a loan to help your kids go to college. But now you're denied that loan because they said your house isn't worth anything because it's within that red box. And then your house can't bring enough taxes to that community, the taxes that are used in order to have infrastructure, good roads, sanitation, schools. And so you end up with bad everything in that community that politicians allowed to have happen so that they could profit and grow. And then they create a narrative that that's a slum, that's a ghetto. And you turn that narrative around and you make them feel and think and believe, and others believe, that they have a problem. They can't function, they can't do for themselves. And meanwhile, the white societies that fled, their homes are valued higher. They're able to use those dollars to invest and to grow, send their kids to college. So imagine my parents dealing with that unlawful practice of redlining and refusing to move into those areas. And so my parents, they wanted to have access to good land, clean air, good water. And I would watch my parents argue with realtors, and finally my parents found a home where I grew up. And now I have a home with a backyard and woods to play in and catch frogs and chase fireflies at night. And my parents are hoping that maybe now, after all that happened, there's hope that the American dream can now be pursued, maybe in my generation, that there will be happiness and peace. Now imagine my story, that community, my grandparents, my parents, and now here I am. And I have been fortified with all of the knowledge that these wonderful black people taught me and led by example. And now here I am, ready to take on living in an all-white community, being the only black child in that community, and then making white friends. And I'm thinking that everything is good. I'm just a kid in elementary school. And one day, me and my friend are walking home, and we leaned between two parked cars because there was no sidewalks in that town, and we're looking both ways the way kids are taught to do. Make sure we don't get hit by a car. And as we're walking home, a gentleman pulls up in his car, a blue car. I still can see the man's face to this day. I know where he lives. I know where the house is still to this day. And this adult in a car rolls his window down and says to a child, "Nigger, if you ever touch my car again, I will kill you." And at that moment, everything that those black lives taught me, those teachers, those grandparents, my own parents, watching what was happening in Washington, D.C. during the Civil Rights era, it all came into me. But I knew at that moment that I too had to begin again. But instead, I became a man quickly, way too soon. But instead of fear Instead of letting anger overwhelm me, what that man did in that car, he flipped a switch in me. And instead of making me a Negro, keeping me in my place, he turned me into an activist, a little junior mini activist. And I went back to school that day a different person. And in fact, I went back to school with some compassion still in my heart. After what just happened, I looked for my white friend to see if he was okay. I was looking for him, but he wasn't looking for me. See, perhaps maybe he went home and told his parents what had happened, and his parents said, see, that's what happens when you hang out with black folk. They're trouble. Or maybe his parents were good people, like many white folk that my parents knew, my grandparents knew, I knew, but they too could suffer the same fate if they supported a black movement, if they supported black rights. So maybe his parents told him, keep your mouth shut. Whatever it was, I lost a friend and many other friends because I was just black. So imagine my story. Imagine my family. Imagine those generations that are very tangible generations. This isn't a story that happened hundreds of years ago. These are people that I actually got hugs from, that held my hand and guided me and taught me to be the man that I am today. These aren't some individuals in the past that I'm dreaming about. These aren't ghosts. These are real, tangible individuals that are alive right now, today. I have black kids 50 years later telling me similar stories. White kids sharing their stories, Latin kids sharing their stories, Asian kids sharing their stories. And I'm seeing the same hate. Oftentimes people think that systemic racism is something that began right after the Civil War. In theory, yes, but when you really think about systemic racism, it really begins with the making of America. Our forefathers, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, many of those architects of democracy knew that slavery was wrong, but they began to plant those seeds long before the Civil War, long before the Reconstruction and Jim Crow. They began to plant those seeds by saying that we know slavery is wrong, but there's so much money being made in these Virginia territories and parts of the South that we can't eradicate slavery right now. Sometimes the presidents themselves, Thomas Jefferson himself wrote that, saying that he wants to get rid of slavery, but it has to take time. We have to figure out how to somehow take all of that free labor that made so much money for America and somehow replace that free labor in some way that can free the black man. Remember I said systemic racism is oftentimes very much tied to economy, making money, money and power. It is amazing how our history books don't talk about the effects of systemic racism in the black communities that thrived. The narrative is oftentimes trying to show that black communities are ghettos, slums, uneducated. They need us. White people need to be there to be their savior. But it was completely the opposite. The communities thrived. They were able to work and sustain and be fruitful. So what happened in Oklahoma in 1921? That wasn't the only massacre of successful black communities. Colfax, Louisiana massacre, 1873. Wilmington, North Carolina massacre, 1898. Atlanta massacre, 1906. Elaine, Arkansas massacre, 1919. Rosewood, Florida massacre, 1923. And right here in South Carolina, those race riots took part. The Hamburg massacre in 1876. Sometimes referred to as the Red Shirt Massacre. These are just a few of the massacres that took place in America on black communities that were thriving and doing extraordinarily well. And for that very reason, that is why these black communities were destroyed. As I mentioned at the top of the program, the summer reading theme was Imagine Your Story. One of the things I like to point out when you talk about issues of race and race relations, systemic racism. Take the time to have conversations with each other. Take the time to talk to your elders. See, in much of our world, we tend to think that individuals who articulate well, dressed in a suit and a tie, have doctor before their name, or went to some kind of really great college, we tend to put them on this pedestal, and we tend to think that they have all the facts, all the knowledge, that they are the ones who we should listen to. But we forget about having those moments of conversations with, the farmers, the truckers, elders who have lived a life of truth, sitting with them on a porch, breaking bread with them at dinner, and listening to their stories. You'll find out more truth and more fact about what really goes on in America. I've discovered that here in South Carolina with the Gullah community. There is a history, and there's a language, there's a culture, there's a way of worship, there's food. That history of food is the foundation of much of the food in the American South. Those are the questions, and those are the reasons why I became a documentary filmmaker. Those are the reasons why I work so hard to have these conversations with people, put programs like this together so that people will just wake up and listen and understand. It's not that complicated. Just listen to us. And don't take our stories as folktales, as fake news. Listen to us, and then you will actually connect the dots to the history, past and present. You will see how voting rights are denied today. You'll understand by just listening to our stories. See, we were telling the world for decades, for centuries, what was happening to our communities. But it took the digital age to really wake people up. And now people are ready to react and go, oh, I guess they're telling the truth. We need to take the time and understand and listen. That's all we're asking. And there's a generation of people out there who may not have even known about redlining or the Great Migration or understood exactly what poll taxes were. You may be participating in systemic racism and not even realize it. You may be living in a bubble, a community that's all white. You gotta ask yourself, how often do I get outside of that bubble and interact with the Black community, the Latin community, the Asian community that surrounds me? Not just to go out to a restaurant that's Thai or try some Ethiopian food, but actually take time to spend time with Black families, invite them to your house. And Black families, I ask the same of you. I know we have a history that is painful with dealing with white folk. And I know we have opened our doors many a times to white folk. But we have to continue to create some kind of comfortable opportunity to have this uncomfortable conversation about race. If you do nothing else, if you don't read the books that I've suggested, do read one thing. Read the op-ed piece that John Lewis wrote himself prior to his passing, and he wanted it to be read at his eulogy. Read that. That pretty much puts everything that I'm talking about succinctly into a few paragraphs that explains the importance of us working together to end hate. Here's my book list to learn more. Begin Again by Eddie Glaude Jr. James Baldwin grew disillusioned by the failure of the civil rights movement to force America to confront its lies about race. In our own movement, when that confrontation feels more urgently needed than ever, we can learn from his struggle. In The Color of Law, Richard Rothstein argues with exacting precision how segregation in America continues to dog our major cities and has contributed to so much recent social strife, the byproduct of explicit government policies at the local, state, and federal levels. Of Other Sons, Pulitzer Prize-winning author Isabel Wilkerson chronicles one of the great untold stories of American history the decades-long migration of Black citizens who fled the South from northern and western cities in search for a better life. I'm Julian Gooding, and I hope to see you soon, and I hope you learned something. And take a moment to see the book list that I have, and read those books, learn more, and we'll talk more through emails. And I hope to see you soon in our libraries again.